The City Travel with Kids podcast, helping you plan big city trips with kids. Brought to you by Little City Trips.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for this week's City Travel with Kids podcast. I'm your host, Kerry Hedrick, and today we're talking all about Melbourne, Australia. I'm joined here today by my co-host, Marta. Hi, Marta.
Hi, Kerry. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. I don't know about you, but I'm super excited to talk about today's episode. It's actually, Melbourne's one of the cities I grew up in and spent a number of my years and my early years working in Melbourne. So it's got a very special place in my heart. But because I haven't actually lived there for a couple of years, we have invited along today Katy Clarke from Untold Morsels to tell us a little bit more about being in Melbourne with kids. Before we jump into it though, Marta, have you ever been to Melbourne?
No, I haven't. I haven't been to Australia. So I'm really excited about this one.
How have I known you all this time and you've never admitted this to me before?
I've never been to Australia, but Melbourne in particular. I have friends from here, from Ireland, who lived there for quite a while, and they can't get over the city. They can't get over how much there is to do. The coffee. I keep hearing about the coffee in Melbourne. I was like, I'm Italian. Like, I should go check it out, see what the hype is all about. So anyway, yeah, I'm really excited about hearing about it from a local.
Absolutely. The food and the coffee are definitely one of Melbourne's strong points. Also, the fact that there's something in Melbourne, I think, for absolutely everybody. And I'm sure Katy will touch on this in the interview, that everything from sporting to arts to culture, there's something that everyone in the family can enjoy in Melbourne. Before we jump into that, though, we're just going to take one of our reader questions that we pick up from our City Travel with Kids Facebook group. Did you want to read out today's question, Marta?
Yeah, so the question we have today is, we are heading to Queensland next summer for around 3 weeks and want to try and fit in time to see Melbourne and Sydney too before we fly to Cairns. Would this be doable in 1 week, or should we just focus on one city?
That's
Kerry?
A really good question. Yes, I think the one thing any visitor to Australia for the first time needs to be aware of is just the sheer size of the country. A lot of people kind of look on a map and Melbourne and Sydney and Queensland all look quite close to one another, but there's actually some vast differences to cover there. So what I normally recommend to people is to try and focus on one city and then take one road trip. So whether that's between Melbourne and Sydney, or you're flying to Sydney, then road trip part of Queensland. But unless you've got a good month or two to spend, I wouldn't spend all that time driving, or just choose one place to focus on. Okay. That said, the option she's given there is, if they're going to be in Queensland for, say, 3 weeks, then yes, I think in a week you could touch on Melbourne and Sydney, but you'd only be touching the highlights for both cities. So it is quite doable to, say, do 3 days Sydney, a transit day, 3 days Melbourne, and then fly up to Cairns.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, that's really useful to know.
If anyone wants to learn more about what to do in Sydney, if you do have a short itinerary, you can jump back to episode 4 of this podcast. Right, now let's get on and talk about this week's feature city, Melbourne. Melbourne often lives in the shadow of its big brother over the border, Sydney, but what it might lack in the same glamour that Sydney throws off, it gives back in spades in terms of its world-class sporting events, arts and cultural offering, not to mention its amazing foodie scene and all-round family friendliness.
Before we hear the interview, I just want to remind you that if you want to be kept up to date with all our latest episodes, then don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. And if you have any questions after listening to today's episode, you can come and chat to us in our Facebook group, City Travel with Kids. We would love to see you there. You can also find lots of information on our family travel guide on the Little City Trips website.
Finally, if there's anything you didn't catch on today's episode, you can go back to our show notes, which are kept at littlecitytrips.com/podcast, and we'll be linking there all the things that we talk about today. We're going to pass over to Marianne now, who sat down with Katy earlier this week to talk all about Melbourne.
Hello, I'm Marianne Rogerson, and today I am joined by Katy Clarke, mum of 5-year-old twins and writer of the travel blog Untold Morsels. Katy was born and bred in Melbourne, and after some time living in London, she is now back living in Melbourne with her family. Hi, Katy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Marianne. Thank you for having me.
Now, I actually spent a week in Melbourne in January this year, and my husband is there for work all the time. He's there right now, actually. So I'm sure we'll be heading down there again soon. So I'm really looking forward to getting some insider info from a Melbourne local today, and I'll be making notes for my next visit.
Wonderful.
So, Katie, why don't you start off by telling us a bit about yourself and your family and a bit more about your connection with Melbourne?
Okay, great. Well, we're a family of four, and our twins are 5, they're nearly 6, and they were born in Melbourne, but we moved to London for 4 years, and we really recently returned and are just having a lot of fun exploring our city. It's changed actually a lot in 4 years, so it's very different to the city that we left. There's lots more things for kids to do, and it's lots of variety. So it's never trouble finding activities or, outings for kids in Melbourne.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to hear all your insider tips today. Now, from a tourist's point of view, I know that Sydney often overshadows Melbourne, and there's a great rivalry between the two cities, isn't there? We've already covered Sydney on our podcast in episode number 4, but as someone who knows Melbourne so well, why do you think it is such a great city to visit with kids?
Well, Melbourne it doesn't have the glamour of Sydney, but what we lack in glamour, we make up in a huge mix of activities that suit all types of families. So it's really a great city to visit no matter what your interests are. So one minute you can be immersed in our really strong sporting history, and the next minute you can be discovering art and culture. We're also very well renowned for our food. And there's always something happening. There's always events and festivals and fun things happening that are catered to all age groups. So it's not just little kids, but there's, sort of pre-teen kids and teenagers as well. So pretty much any of the events that take place in Melbourne will have activities that can be suitable for those age groups.
Yeah, we were actually there for the Australian Open tennis in January, and I was amazed all around the city. There were so many different things going on. They just did it really, really well.
Yeah, it happens throughout the year. It's actually quite overwhelming because there's literally always something on, whether it's a cultural festival, like there might be a Japanese festival or a Peruvian festival. Oh, cool. And it's really fun. So if we just head into the city on a whim, we can usually find something to do. You don't really have to plan it out months in advance.
Fabulous. Okay, well, before we get into all the fun stuff, let's maybe talk about some of the important things we need to know before we go to Melbourne. Now, I know that Melbourne is notorious for its fickle weather. Is there a best time to visit, a bad time to visit?
Well, I think the best time to visit is every time. However, I do think there's better times. So if you're looking for that famous Aussie sunshine, it's not really worth coming in winter because winter can be pretty brutal here in Melbourne. It's not as cold as it would get in London, but it feels colder somehow. I don't know why. It just really does. And summers can be very, very hot. So if you're not used to temperatures of around mid to high 30s centigrade, up to 40 degrees, then you probably won't have a great time in Melbourne during the summer. And also around that time in summer, people usually escape the city between Christmas and New Year, so there's not a lot happening then. So if you wanted to, that's kind of good in some ways, but I think part of Melbourne's charm is the hustle and bustle of a big city, and that doesn't really happen over Christmas and New Year. And I guess the other thing I wanted to mention was that if you're on a budget, you might want to avoid times around the major sporting events. So you mentioned the Australian Open, but there's other major sporting events such as the Spring Racing Carnival, Grand Prix, or the Aussie Rules Finals, and that's when accommodation prices really skyrocket and it's harder to find accommodation. So they're the times that I would avoid if you're wanting to travel on a budget. But of course, you may want to visit for those reasons alone, and many people do.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, and talk to me about getting around Melbourne. It's famous for its trams. Are they the best way to get around the city? Are there other options? Is it stroller friendly?
I think Melbourne is very walkable. It's a small city, so you can't really go wrong just walking. And we like to walk everywhere we go, really. But if you need some transport, we're actually really lucky in that all the trams in the city centre are free. So you can jump on and off a tram if the legs are getting tired. And so that's not just for residents, it's for tourists, it's for everyone. So you can jump on and off any tram within a sort of like a square grid area, and it covers most of the attractions actually, which is really handy. I guess then the other thing that you should know is that there is a free tourist tram that does a loop of the city where you can jump on and off, and it takes about 50 minutes and it passes by all of the things that people usually want to see. So it's kind of like a hop on, hop off bus, but it's a tram.
Perfect. And it's free. That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's wonderful. And so then if you've got a stroller, we've got very wide footpaths and wide streets, so it's very easy to walk around. I think there's a few big hills, but apart from that, if you need to avoid those hills, just jump on a tram. It's easy.
Great. And how about getting in and out from the airport? What's the best way to do that?
We don't really have a great transport system out to the airport, unfortunately. There is an airport bus. However, I would generally stick to a taxi or a private car.
Sure.
It's very quick.
Okay, great. Is there anything else we should know?
The only other thing that I would mention is that Melbourne has a lot of great family facilities. So especially in some of the shopping centres in the central business district, if you need a nappy change or you just want some time out, there's some family-friendly sort of time-out areas in the big shopping centres. Emporium has an excellent one where you can just go and sit on a couch and feed your baby or change them and just generally have a rest if you need to. And I think that's a really excellent service that I didn't see in many other countries, actually.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's get into the fun stuff then. I imagine a lot of people visit Melbourne as part of a longer visit to Australia rather than a long visit to Melbourne itself. So let's imagine that we only have 3 days in the city. What are some of the must-do things we shouldn't miss? And maybe you could just talk us through an itinerary for 3 days.
Great. Well, 3 days is an excellent amount of time to have in Melbourne. I think you'd cover most of the highlights. So on the first day, I would recommend taking the City Circle tram that I mentioned, the tourist tram. So that's a really great way to get your bearings and understand how Melbourne's laid out and how it developed. Melbourne is a town that's built on the gold rush, so it was quite wealthy back in the day and probably still is. And so you've got some grand buildings that the City Circle tram will take you past. One of those is the State Library, which is an absolutely beautiful building, and even from the outside, but you really need to go inside and take a look inside and look at what is one of the most beautiful reading rooms that I've ever seen in this country and around the world. And it's stunning. You can do a tour of that. There's also some great kids' activities that they run throughout the year. And the next thing that I would do is visit our famous laneways. So Melbourne is, like I mentioned, is built on a grid, but in between that grid there's a series of laneways, and they're really quite atmospheric, and it's been made even more so with street art and murals. So there's lots of different nooks and crannies around the city where you can find some amazing artwork that's just been put there by local street artists.
Okay.
And it's very famous and people love to get their selfies and photos taken there, but you can just explore and find all the different artworks that you like. And some of the most famous streets are Hosier Lane and Manchester Lane. I like just looking around because if you just look on little corners, you can see cute little like animals that people have put there. It's a really nice part of Melbourne. It's really quite different.
Great for your Instagram page.
Absolutely, especially those teenagers love it. There's a lot of posing that goes on.
I can imagine.
Yeah. Okay. So then after you've done that, you probably want to grab some lunch. And there's so many options in Melbourne. It's actually a little bit overwhelming, I think. Some of the things that we like to do is go for dumplings. So we've got some great dumpling places. One of the favourite ones is Hutong. And it's pretty cheap and cheerful and it's fast and you get served quickly and you'll get out of there quickly and so you can go back to your sightseeing. And it's just delicious. If you get a bad meal in Melbourne, you should let me know because it doesn't happen that often. And when it does, people get quite annoyed. So it's a really great place if you want to get, your kids to branch out as well because we've got some great all different types of cuisines that they can try.
Fantastic.
So after lunch, I would head over to the Eureka Tower if you wanted to do some sightseeing up on high. So at the Eureka Tower, you can get a 360-degree view of Melbourne and the surrounds. So you can see the bay that Melbourne's built on, Port Phillip Bay, and out across the bay to Williamstown. It's another suburb of Melbourne. And then back the other way to the Dandenong Ranges. So you can actually see just in sort of landmass how big Melbourne is. It's quite a huge city now. It's of 5 million people, but it's very spread out too. So you can see the skyscrapers of the city and then all of the surrounding area. So it's quite a fun thing to do. And they've got, if you like heights, if you're okay with heights, then you can try this experience they have that's called The Edge, which is like a glass box that moves out across the ground below. It's not really for me.
No, not for me either. But.
I'm not really, but some people like it, and it's a bit, especially I think teenagers or older children will find that quite fun. So, the Eureka Tower is a good spot. But if you weren't into that, I would head over to the Botanic Gardens, which is just a short walk away. And there's a children's garden there called the Ian Potter Garden, and smaller children particularly enjoy that, running around and in between garden beds, and there's water play and there's lots of fun things to do there.
Fabulous.
So that would be my day one.
Okay. And what's happening on day two?
Well, on day two, I would head over to the Melbourne Museum, which is in Carlton. Now, it's just on the city fringe, so you can actually walk there very easily from most places in the centre of the city, but you could also get a tram there. And at the Melbourne Museum is a great indoor space and outdoor space, actually, for smaller children under 5. So if it's a rainy day, it's a really good option. It's called the Children's Gallery, and there's just so many things to do. There's climbing and jumping and stories and digging for fossils and lots of fun things to do for little kids. But these exhibits are very good for older children too. So there's one all about volcanoes that shows, there's a 3D movie that shows how lava moves through the Earth's core and explodes. It's pretty cool. And the museum cafe is very good too, and there's a playground inside the museum. But the best thing near the museum is there's a playground behind it, which is suitable for lots of different age groups. So there's a little kids playground and a big kids playground. So what we tend to do is, go to the museum, enjoy some of the exhibits there, and then grab a coffee and a snack, and then go over to the Carlton Gardens.
Sounds perfect. We love a playground.
Absolutely. Yeah, you definitely need them. It's just to break up the day, I think. It makes a big difference. So after lunch, you can grab lunch at the museum, or there's lots of restaurants and cafes nearby in Carlton, which is a very famous area for Italian immigrants to Australia.
Okay.
And there's just lots of yummy things to eat there. But I'm giving you a couple of options on day two. If you like to see animals, you could go to the aquarium, which has got a really cool, actually I love the penguin display there. It's very cute. There's all penguins zipping in and out of the display, and you can see them underwater swimming away.
We actually went to the aquarium, and I thought it was really good. We've done those sea life aquariums in quite a few places, but I thought the Melbourne one was done really well.
Yes, it's fantastic. And they've got, my husband's actually been swimming with a shark in,
Oh, really?
in that aquarium, which was quite fun to watch, but I don't think I would be doing that either. But they do have lots of different unique experiences that you can do at the aquarium too. The other option would be, if your kids are interested in sports, is you can do a tour of the MCG, which is the Melbourne Cricket Ground, and it's one of the biggest stadiums in the world. It holds, I think it's over 100,000 people, and it's an iconic landmark for Melbourne, and it's the place where, some great sporting moments have been held, including the 1956 Olympics. So that tour, you can actually walk on the ground and go to the dressing rooms, and it's a really good thing to do if you're interested in sports. So I'd recommend that for teenagers or above.
Sure.
So then if you somewhere for dinner, I mentioned Melbourne's Italian heritage, and there's a fantastic restaurant or cafe really in the city called Brunetti's, and it's a Melbourne institution. They've been for decades, they've been in Melbourne, and they've just brought a brilliant level of Italian food and service to Melbourne. So you can go there for pizza, pasta, just snacks, but I think everyone really likes to go there for cake and coffee and gelato. Or if anyone's a fussy eater, they can find something to eat there, and you can get a glass of wine if you're after a long day for the parents, and a coffee to finish off with, and a beautiful cake. There's too many to choose from, and I'm sure they'll be asking to go back afterwards.
Sounds perfect.
And on day 3, that day I would start off at the Queen Victoria Market.
Okay.
So that's our famous central market, it's quite unique actually. It's a very large market, and there's 2 sections. There's one for variety goods, so toys, clothes, etc. And there's another section for fresh produce. So you could go to the Queen Vic Market and pick up souvenirs. And so it's a great place to pick up, those clip-on koalas.
Oh, yeah.
People love those. And also not the official Ugg boots, but the Ugg boots that were there before the Ugg boots. So sheepskin lined boots, which are much, much cheaper than if you buy the branded Ugg boots. You can get really good deals on those at the Queen Vic Market. You can also get a great breakfast and coffee there. So it's open from, I think, 6 o'clock in the morning. So you can go there and see all the hustle and bustle of the general market. And then you can also get things to eat, and there's delicious coffee, croissants and pastries and it's one of the best places to go for food in Melbourne, actually.
Yeah.
You can pick up a picnic if you needed to.
Mm-hmm.
After that, I've got another couple of options too. So there's one is the old Melbourne jail. So this is what it says on the packet. It's the old jail for Melbourne. And this one ceased operating in, I think, the 1920s. And it's kind of it's a bit of a spooky place, but it's also a bit of fun. So you can go there and dress up in prisoner outfits and see how they would have been shackled, etc. And there's people telling stories, and you can go around and really imagine what it was like to be incarcerated.
Mm-hmm. I took my kids there, actually, and they had a really cool treasure hunt for the kids to do with the UV light.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. I love it when they do things like that. I did know that, actually, and that makes it so much more interactive for children.
Yeah.
I think it makes the history come alive, and I think it's really worth.
Yeah, and they do the whole mock-up of you're a prisoner, and they take you through as if you're a prisoner and lock you in the room and stuff. It was quite fun.
Oh, did they like that?
Yeah, they were okay. They lined us all up against the wall, and they wanted boys on one side and girls on the other, so I had to keep my little boy with me. But apart from that, they thought it was quite fun.
Oh, at night time they've got ghost tours that you can do. I think that's probably more. I think they say you have to be 16 or over to do that.
Yeah.
I'm a bit of a scaredy cat. I wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd be up for that either.
So the other option would be, if that didn't appeal, you could go to our National Gallery, which is a wonderful art resource in Melbourne. So it's got a permanent exhibition, but I think what's really fantastic about it is the visiting exhibition. So at the moment we've got the terracotta warriors from China and cross-purposed with a more modern Chinese artist. Mm-hmm. And there's always a kids section for these major exhibitions, so you can go and the kids can experience it at their own level. And I really find that it's very engaging and lots of fun for the kids, and they really engage well with the art, and it inspires their creativity. So for us, we really love those creative experiences, so we tend to go there quite often. Mm-hmm. Even just entering the building is fun because it's got a fountain. It's called a fountain, but it's really water that just drips down the glass outside, and they can put their hands in it and stick leaves in it, and no one is worried about it. That's what kids are supposed to do, and I like the fact that kids are welcome in this space that's really to do with fine art.
Yeah, I went there as well, actually, and I think that's one of the best kids resources I've ever seen at an art gallery. I thought it was really, really brilliantly done. Yeah,
they've really thought long and hard about how to make it relevant for kids, and I think they do a great job of making it accessible for lots of different age groups.
Yeah.
So then, after doing those two activities in the afternoon, I would head down to our beachside suburb of St Kilda. St Kilda is it's a really fun place to go, and it's not quite Bondi. We don't pitch it that way, but it is a nice wide sandy beach, and the sea is very calm. So it's if it's a hot day, you can definitely go swimming there, and it's quite safe. And it's a sandy beach, and there's always people having fun on the beach. You can either swimming or paddle boarding or kite surfing, and you can walk along the pier. And if you stay there until dusk, you can see our favourite little St Kilda residents there, which are the fairy penguins.
Very cool.
And there's over 1,000 little fairy penguins that live on the St Kilda pier, and they just they're so cute.
Wow.
They can jump in and out of the water, and you usually see them at dusk when they're sort of sorting themselves out for the evening.
Uh-huh. And how long does it take to get to St Kilda, and how do we get there?
We get there on the tram, and there's several trams that just go from outside Flinders Street Station, which is our major train station in Melbourne, and it's a very obvious building. It's a very classic building. So there's train stations out the front there, and there's always transport helpers there to help you get onto the right tram. Okay. It only takes 25 minutes or 30 minutes to get down there. And then there's lots of things to do down there. You don't have to spend any money if you don't want to. You can just simply enjoy the beach or go for a walk on the pier, which has got beautiful views back of Melbourne. Or you can go to, we've got an amusement park down there called Luna Park. It's kind of an older style one that's been there since, I think, the 1920s, and it's got an iconic sort of laughing face. You've got one in Sydney too, I think.
We do, yes, yeah.
And it's a bit of fun. But if you don't want to spend any money, you don't have to. It's very chill down at St Kilda, and there's lots of cafes and restaurants to enjoy as well.
Nice. I think you've got an article on your blog about St Kilda.
I do.
Yeah, so we will link to that one in the show notes.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that sounds like a lot of awesome things we've covered already. What if we had longer than 3 days? Is there anything you've missed out that you would like to add on, or any cool day trips we could do from Melbourne?
Actually, there's actually too many day trips to choose from, and we kind of get stuck, really, because, we want to do it all. But if you had to choose one that I would do, is probably the Yarra Valley, because apart from the fact that it's got wineries, which is always fantastic, there's also fantastic things to do for kids. You'd have to rent a car to get there, really. You can do tours, but I think a car gives you the flexibility, and it's quite easy. It's a very easy drive, and it's just around an hour out of the city. So you would go to the Hillsville Sanctuary, which is a native wildlife park, and this is where you can get very close to Australian native animals. Like, you can really you're like literally, a few meters away from koalas, kangaroos, and you're walking in their natural habitat. So it's a very lovely environment. It doesn't feel like a zoo. It is actually a zoo, because they are trying to help rehabilitate animals that have been injured and protect those that are in danger of being extinct. However, it's very much in their natural environment, and you can really, see how they live and get around the bush.
Great.
One of our favourite things there is there's a birds of prey display. So you sit in this sort of little amphitheatre, and the birds are swooping over the top of you and grab meat in their claws, and they're just absolutely amazing animals, and it's a really cool experience.
Fabulous.
And you can also, so after you've been to the sanctuary, it's a good couple of hours to go there to get your koala selfie and your kangaroo selfie. You can go to there's some fantastic wineries that cater for kids, and you can just go winery hopping if you wanted to, and taste the wines as adults, and the kids will be fine, because there's so many activities that the wineries put on for the kids to make it family friendly.
Fantastic.
So one of our favourite ones is De Bortoli, which has a playground, and another one is St Helens Hill Estate, where they've got treasure hunt maps and colouring books and sports equipment and what have you. And another one is Oak Ridge Wines, that has giant chess and giant Jenga, which is lots of fun.
Cool. I do love a family-friendly winery.
Oh, who doesn't? It's what dreams are made of, right? So then on the way home, because everyone will be tired and probably need a bit of a sweet kicker, there is the Yarra Valley Chocolate Factory, which also has ice cream, which is a very popular place to stop on the way home.
And would you stay in the Yarra Valley, or would you just do that as a day trip?
You can definitely stay there. Yes, I would stay. There's so much to do there. I missed out on all those waterfalls and short walks and longer hikes. You can hire bikes and ride along an old railroad. It's a wonderful place to spend some time. I definitely recommend a couple of days. But the challenge is that there's so many places like that near Melbourne. So another one is the Mornington Peninsula, where you've got the hot springs there and an adventure playground, zipline playground, and there's a fabulous winery that has sculpture garden that you can spend hours walking around. So that's another option. Yeah. And of course the Great Ocean Road, which I haven't mentioned yet, which a lot of people try and do on a day trip, and it is possible. And I wouldn't try and do that on your own. You'd definitely join a tour for that one. But if you were staying a little longer, take 2 to 3 days to see the Great Ocean Road. It's actually my favourite part of the world. My parents lived down at the start of the drive down there, and it's so beautiful. It's a rugged coastline it's just nature at its finest, and then you've got the rock formations, but also inland you have the rainforest. And it's just a very beautiful, unique part of the world that is very special to me, and that I hope many people get to experience.
I agree. We did that in January when we were in Melbourne. We did 4 days to do it, and it just blew me away. It was really stunning. Loved it.
Oh, where did you stay?
We came from the Mornington Peninsula. So we started the Mornington Peninsula, then we got the ferry across, then we did a night in Lorne, and then 2 nights in...
Apollo Bay?
Yes.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And then we went up to the Grampians and then into Ballarat and then back to Melbourne. It was an amazing road trip.
Yeah, all the landscapes there are so different and unique.
Yeah.
You can see so many different parts of Victoria. We're very lucky.
Yeah, no, it's really beautiful. Great. Okay, let's maybe talk a bit about best areas for families to stay, and maybe if you have any specific recommendations for family-friendly hotels.
Sure. There's two main areas I'd stay in if I was going as a first-time visitor. Staying in the CBD is a great idea because you can just literally walk everywhere. And I haven't mentioned this so far, but we have a lot of parks and gardens. So if you stay right in the centre of the city, you've got those parks and gardens just within steps of where you're staying. So it's a very useful area to stay. Plus, you've got all the cafes and restaurants. So a really great hotel that's right in the centre, that's budget and has really large rooms. Actually, it's one of those ones where you go, really? Is that the right price? Is the Victoria Hotel on Little Collins Street, and it's in a excellent location, and you couldn't want for anything else really. It's just one of those places that's got the space for families and separate beds, which is always welcome.
Yes.
And got the great location. If you want something a little bit more luxurious, the South Bank is probably got the most range of hotels. So that's the area south bank of the River Yarra, which Melbourne is built around. And there's a big convention centre there, so a lot of people come for business meetings, but on the weekend it also caters for families.
Okay. Is that where the Crown Casino is?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And if you're not into gambling, don't worry. It's also a great place for restaurants and shopping, if you like shopping too. And there's a kids' play area in there where you can do small sort of video games, etc. But it's an easy area to stay in. So a hotel that we really like is the Crown Metropole. It's really good value. Again, you've got like those bigger rooms, larger beds, and the extra bonus of the Crown Metropole is that it has an indoor infinity pool.
Nice.
You can, and which with spectacular views actually. So it's just a really great value hotel. I'll tell you one more if you wanted it, like the ultimate in luxury. So Key West Suites are the luxury option. They've also got an indoor lap pool and an on-site restaurant, but the real benefit there is the size of the room. So you can get suites with 2 bedrooms, and you've got this great location right on South Bank opposite Flinders Street Station and spectacular views. And I think if you were going to splurge, that's where I'd stay.
Perfect. And what about St Kilda? You mentioned that earlier. Is that a good place to stay or not really, because it's a bit further away?
Well, I think you've got to pick the right area of St Kilda because there's a lot of it can be a little bit edgy at night time. Okay. But there's one section of St Kilda where is one of my favourite hotels, the Blackman. It's one of the art series hotels that we have in Melbourne, which are focused around a particular artist, and they're more boutique style. Okay. And that's got some great offerings for families as well. So that's a little bit towards the park sides of St Kilda. And it's a really nice spot. You can hire bikes there and walk to the beach, and it's a better area for families, I think.
Okay. And then you mentioned earlier, if you're visiting Melbourne during any of those big sporting events, then just to make sure you book ahead early, right?
Absolutely. So, for example, it's the Spring Racing Carnival is coming up in October and November, and you'll find it very difficult to get accommodation for those times now. So, because we're talking in September. Yeah. And then if you're looking at the Australian Open, tennis, you would be wanting to book that as soon as possible because that's very popular.
So we stayed before the tennis, then we went away and did our big road trip, and then we came back for the tennis. We stayed in the same hotel both times, and the price doubled during the tennis weekend. So
wow. Yeah.
Okay, so you touched a bit earlier on a few restaurants. Now Melbourne is probably known as the restaurant capital of Australia. Is there anything particular we need to know about eating out with kids? Is everywhere pretty child friendly, and if you've got any other specific recommendations you can give us?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, I think everyone is very welcoming of children, and if you don't find a kids menu, you can definitely just talk to the wait staff and they'll help you find something that's suitable. I guess the only places I'd really avoid is fine dining, but you don't really want to take your kids along to that necessarily anyway. But there's so many casual options, you really don't need to worry about finding food. I think the hardest thing is actually sifting through everything to make a choice, because there's so many great places to eat. I mentioned Brunetti's before, which is pizza, pasta, cake, and gelato. The hutong, the dumplings.
Yep.
But there's a lot of great Asian restaurants, and I think that's what we're really, really good at in Melbourne, is really well-priced, high-quality Asian food, and from all over Asia, lots of different styles that you can try. If you get stuck and no one can agree on what they want to eat, which I know happens in our family a little bit, you can go to the Emporium shopping centre. That doesn't sound so exciting, I'm sorry, but it really is, because a lot of the restaurants in Melbourne have done a little, not a pop-up because it's permanent, but they have smaller outlets there in the Emporium shopping centre in the food court, and you can choose from, you can get anything there. You can get great Vietnamese pho soup, you can get tacos, Malaysian, anything you can think of there, and it's really quite a nice environment. It's not standard fluorescent lighting food court. It's quite nice. But everyone's talking about this now, so I'll let you guys in on the secret. Is desserts, freak shake desserts and ice cream desserts are very popular at the moment here in Melbourne, and there's a company called Milk Cow, and they do kind of the ultimate in sweet treats, like freak shakes and waffles, and with fairy floss. There's even a unicorn one, which I'll be letting my daughter have a go at for her birthday, and probably never again.
Yeah. And that's in the Emporium, is it?
Well, there's one on Swanston Street, actually. There's a Milk Cow, but I saw they're making another one on Elizabeth Street, so they're kind of going to surround us, I think.
Okay, sounds amazing. And then I have to ask you, because Melbourne is probably the most famous place to get coffee, where should we go for the best coffee in Melbourne?
Oh, that's so hard.
Putting you on the spot.
There's some really great places. I like Mr. Tulk, which is near the State Library that I mentioned before, and actually that's a great place to stop for a snack. And I also like Journal, which is in the City Library. It's a smaller library, actually. We don't talk a lot about libraries here, but it's got great coffees. And right opposite there, you can never go wrong with Brunetti's for coffee. It's Italian. It's consistently good. And I enjoy going there just for the atmosphere too.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about packing for Melbourne. Now, we've talked about how fickle the weather can be, and you're famous for experiencing 4 seasons in a day. So is there anything specific, clothing or travel gear, that we should bring with us?
Well, I would always, even if in the middle of summer, you always need to have some sort of jumper or sweater, I think, because you just never know. The temperature can drop by 20 degrees very quickly if we get a cool change, and it can be quite cool. I think for some reason, even if it's 10 to 15 degrees, it still somehow feels colder in Melbourne than it does in other places. I know Canadians who are used to, being snowed in have said they've never felt so cold as they have in Melbourne.
Oh, really?
So if you're visiting in winter, make sure you bring a puffy jacket or something that's going to keep you warm, because it can get quite cool. But the winds come from Antarctica, that's why. The other thing I would recommend is bringing a water bottle, and I say this for every destination, but I think it's just so important these days. There's no need to buy water. There's places you can fill up around the city, and our water is excellent drinking water. It's not very chlorinated. It tastes good. There's no need to buy water or use plastic bottles. I think we can all do our little bit to help the environment that way. And
bring your keep cup for your coffee.
Yes. Well, I've got a Frank Green one, which I love. I'm obsessed with it, actually. It's a bit. You can drop it and the coffee doesn't spill. It's fantastic.
Perfect. I need to look into that.
The other thing I want to mention is, if you're coming to Australia, you probably know this already, but you do need sunscreen and cover-ups just in the summer, and actually throughout the year, really. The sun's so much stronger here than if you're coming from Europe or the United States or anywhere in Asia. You just need to make sure that you don't get burnt, because it can be very painful.
Yeah, my husband actually got burnt yesterday, and we're first week of spring, so
yep.
I know you don't want to hear that when you've got hail in Melbourne, but
I know it's just started raining again. So. One other thing to add to your packing list for Melbourne is you would need insect repellent. Our mosquitoes can be quite vicious.
Really? So, I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, well, my kids are allergic to them, actually, so they come out in big welts, which is not very pleasant.
Well, that's a good insider tip then.
Yep. Indeed.
Okay, so we like to finish our podcast episodes with our fast 5 questions.
Okay, go.
Okay then, let's go. So firstly, tell us one hidden gem that we won't find in the guidebooks.
Well, you always find the botanic gardens in the guidebooks because they're fabulous, but most people don't know that you can go on a punting tour on the lake there, and you can have an option to take one with afternoon tea, which is really quite lovely.
Oh, fun. Okay, one thing we should splurge on in Melbourne.
Definitely events. So throughout the year, as I mentioned, there's always something happening, whether it's a sporting event or a show. So at the moment, we've got Harry Potter and the Cursed Child show and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory are on at the moment. So they're definitely worth splurging on, and it is a splurge.
Okay. And one thing we should save our money on.
I would give the Melbourne Star Wheel a miss.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure. The view from one side probably isn't the best.
Okay, fair enough. One can't live without app.
If you're into food, you need the Open Table app so you can make restaurant bookings really easily, and it gives lots of good tips for where to eat.
Okay. And finally, where will we get our playground with a coffee and a view?
Well, I think I mentioned it before, but the Carlton Gardens playground is fantastic. It's got playground equipment for kids of all ages, and you can grab your coffee from the Melbourne Museum Cafe or in nearby Carlton.
Perfect. Katy, thank you so much for sharing all your insider knowledge. I've really enjoyed talking to you today. I've got a whole load of new things for my list for my next visit. Now, before you go, can you please just tell us where we can find you online and on social media?
Thank you, Marianne. So we regularly update our family travel guides and insider travel secrets on our blog Untold Morsels and Facebook page of the same name. So it's got a lot of information that I've just mentioned and some deep dives on Great Ocean Road and St Kilda. But a lot of our content is also on Europe. So we have a lot of information about visiting places in Europe, especially Italy, which is our favourite country. If you're interested in travelling to Italy, we'd love you to join our Italy travel planning Facebook group that has over 18,000 members, just asking questions just like you have about planning trips to Italy. And we also have a new site, Untold Italy, where you'll find all the information you need to plan an incredible family trip to Italy.
Fabulous. Thank you, Katy. Now, remember, we will be sharing everything we talked about today with any useful links in our show notes for today's episode, which you can find at littlecitytrips.com/podcast. And you will also find loads of great information for visiting Melbourne in our Family Guide to Melbourne on our website. If you have any questions following today's episode, you can also jump over to our Facebook group, City Travel with Kids, and we can chat more about Melbourne there or about any questions you have about travelling with kids in general. And if you don't want to miss the next episode of City Travel with Kids, remember to subscribe to the podcast. Until next time, happy travelling, friends.